Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping details. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we begin, I would like to call your attention to our Save the Date for GLR Week 2023 with the theme of Bright Spots and Silver Linings. GLR Week will start next Monday, July 17th, and will go through the 21st. We'll be offering a number of exciting conversations, ranging from public television partners, a governor's conversation, locked out of literacy, including conversations on AI, bright spots and groundwork, and post-pandemic academic recovery. I assure you that one or many of these will pique your interest, and we invite you to join us. Registration and information will be posted in the chat box now, and we're excited to see you soon. Joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Hello and welcome to all joining us. Today's session is going to be a fascinating conversation about literacy legislation, past and present. In the last century, we've seen various movements and moments of big debate over how reading is taught. What is effective? What isn't? Who decides what educators are teaching, et cetera, et cetera. We've also heard the phrase reading wars, which seems to crop up every few decades as new literacy approaches gain popularity and prompt disagreement. Recently, the science of reading has become a sort of buzzword used both negatively and positively. And in the realm of state legislation, it's a prominent topic of conversation. The Albert Shanker Institute has spent the last year in a deep dive of literacy-related legislation, researching, identifying, and analyzing what bills are out there, what they say, and what their aims are. The results of this study promise to be comprehensive, enlightening, with some real myth busting around what is happening with literacy bills. As we get closer to the release of this study, however, reflection on past initiatives is key. In today's session, we will hear first about past efforts to strengthen reading instruction, particularly reading first, lessons learned, and what we've taken forward with us. We're then going to hear from the research team at the Albert Shanker Institute about their motivations and the methodology for this project, followed by how we can use this study in the coming school year and in future legislative efforts. In talking with this research team, I've been just absolutely blown away and completely inspired by their work, and I cannot wait for the release of this study. I'm now happy to introduce all of our speakers. And as a reminder, you can find more detailed bios linked in the chat, as well as in the follow-up materials that you'll receive later this week. First, Susan Neuman, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education and a professor of childhood and early literacy at New York University. Next, we have Esther Quintero, a senior research fellow at the Albert Shanker Institute. Kayla Rice, who is also a research consultant at the Albert Shanker Institute, and Mary Catherine Ricker, Executive Director at the Albert Shanker Institute. Moderating this conversation is Suzanne Minnick, CEO and founder of Minnick Advisors. I'm going to pass it over to you now, Suzanne.
Great. Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, everyone, depending on what coast you're residing on. Thank you so much, Hattie, for the introduction. And I want to say a special thank you before we get started to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for hosting such an important conversation. Clearly, conversations like this grow more and more important each and every day. So thank you to the campaign, and thank you to all of you for taking time to participate in this conversation. As I was preparing for today, I was especially struck by a quote in a recent blog written by Esther Quintero, who will join us in just a little bit as part of the panel. But let me read the quote to you as we kick off. It says, "Essentially, the science of reading is synonymous with academic research on reading. It refers to the vast body of knowledge that scholars have accumulated over decades about how people learn to read. Thus, the phrase is shorthand for work of hundreds of scholars in countless studies. This body of knowledge includes things that are known with certainty, those that we are just beginning to understand, and everything in between. Like any science field, reading science is dynamic and evolving, not settled." So science-based knowledge, dynamic and evolving, key words for our conversation today. So I would like to invite forward Susan Neuman to visit with us a little bit about all that she has championed and endured in this space. So Susan, can you come forward on the screen? There you are, great. So Susan, speaking of dynamic and evolving, can you speak just a little bit about like your reflections, and as we think about the science of reading and where the debate, if you will, stands today and recent legislation? Talk to us a little bit about what you have witnessed being done in the past, what worked, what didn't work, and what we should be thinking about or doing now. And then we'll dive into a little bit more specific, but kind of start with an overarching, moment of reflection, if you would.
Right. Suzanne, thank you for inviting me to this question, because it's something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. It is a wonderful time for reflection. And I have to say that I think we can learn a lot of lessons from Reading First. For some of you, you might recall that Reading First was the largest to date initiative, a $6 billion initiative that was federally funded under No Child Left Behind. And I have to tell you that as Assistant Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education, when this law was passed, I had a moment where I said, finally, we're going to move toward a scientific approach to reading, that no longer were we going to just use Aunt Betty's, home brew to teach reading, but we were actually going to do something that was based on the rich and robust science that we know about reading. And so I think what happened was, it was actually legislation that had to be formed into a proposal. And I had the honor of working with others to form that proposal. And by the way, AFT had a major response to what we were doing at the time. And so one of the things that we recognize is that for struggling readers, they are going to need more time in instruction. And so one of the things that we said was they need 120 minutes of instruction, good 2 hours of instruction. We also said that it probably needs to reflect most on schools that were having difficulties, schools that were struggling to ensure that children were successful. And so we did a number of things that I think really resonate now with what we should be doing. We believed that teachers needed to be the teacher of record In other words, I was a reading specialist, and I would remember going to a room and having a teacher send 13 children out for reading instruction. And I said, wait a second, what is wrong here? So we basically said that teachers were the teacher of record and that we were going to hold them responsible for reading, for what children were doing in the classroom. At the same time, we recognized that everyone in a school, the whole infrastructure, needed to be involved in reading. So that meant the curriculum developer, the coach, the specialists, and the leadership, the administrators needed to be involved in professional development. We also recognized that we needed to know more about how children were doing. So we said progress monitoring was absolutely essential in understanding whether or not our instruction was working and whether we needed to change instruction. And we also recognized that there needed to be core reading instruction, that very often teachers often have to use a cafeteria of different programs. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and there was very little alignment with what they were doing. So those were the critical features that we put in place in the Reading First proposal. And as you know, all of our schools and all of our states participated. And what they did, the state would take that proposal and then they would define what schools really needed to be part of that initiative. They would be Title I schools that really were hurting in some way. And so that was the emphasis on Reading First. And as I said, there were many positive things. But in reflection, you begin to see how something begins to work itself into implementation. And we made some basic mistakes that I'm hoping in this next go round we do. We take note. I think one of the things that we recognize is that Reading First was a federal initiative that went to the states. And what we recognize is that essentially education is a local issue. And it needs to really reflect that local character of the individual local school district and the state. And the federal government really doesn't know enough of what's going on in various states and local areas to really make a decision on what is good and what is not. I think we also recognize that because we were providing a fair amount of funding, that states tended to copycat their proposals. And one of the things we've learned, and that's a natural phenomenon, but one of the things that we learned is that every state is different and every state has different abilities and different infrastructure within that state. And what we recognize is that the state needed greater flexibility, that they know their audience well, and it really needed to have the flexibility for the state to say what is appropriate for their individuals and their families. The other thing we forgot completely, believe it or not, was that parents have an enormous influence in children's education. They need to be at the table from the very beginning. It's essential that we take into account parent notification, parent interaction, knowing that they're so critically important. We also recognize that saying that 120 minutes for reading, oh my gosh, in some places that's appropriate, but in some places what happened is they no longer were teaching science or social studies or doing anything in the fine arts or art. And so therefore we recognize that reading reform really needs to be about literacy and about helping children develop content knowledge. That background knowledge and content knowledge, integrating those skills are critically important. I think one of the other things that we really learned is that most core reading programs, and I say this hopefully to many people, are not scientifically based. They're based on many different people writing different parts of these core reading programs. So every state really needs to look at its curriculum, and they can decide on a particular curriculum, but then they need to see whether there are holes in certain areas. In other words, does that program have a good content-rich experience for the children? But maybe there are holes in that they don't do very much decoding or decodable text or things like that that can really help children. So every state and every district is really going to have to look at the issue of alignment and making sure that they provide a coherent literacy program for those children. And what I mean is I say literacy. So literacy is oral language, it's also writing, and writing helps, sometimes we call it thinking with a pencil. Writing is enormously important in what children are doing and learning. So I think that what we've learned is that we know that it's not just Title I schools, that all of our children need an excellent scientifically based instruction. We also know that science doesn't just sit. There's no such thing as we know the science. For example, some of what we learned in the National Reading Panel report, frankly, is 21 years old. And so therefore we know that teachers are at the center of instruction, and that teachers know when children are learning and when they're not. And so they need to feel free to adjust their curriculum in such a way that they're really meeting those children's needs. So I think what we're arguing in total is that for flexibility and for ongoing analysis, that science is constantly improving, we're constantly learning, and we need not to be settled and satisfied with what we currently know.
I love that, the science evolving, right? We give that acknowledgement to other areas of science, but we often in this space have not allowed it to have some fluidity and evolving and constant conversation and research. So I think that's very powerful for today's conversation. I guess my last question specifically to you would be then, as you look to the next 5 years and you think about teachers at the center, flexibility, curriculum, what do you see as the emerging literacy landscape, and maybe especially with legislation, that balance between federal and state and local, school districts and teachers? What do you see as that landscape, and really specifically with perhaps emerging legislation?
Well, my hope.
Yes.
My hope is that children will receive an aligned instruction that begins from the very beginning. Suzanne, I work with 3- and 4-year-old children, and I think they're brilliant. They're brilliant from the very beginning. And so for many times what we think of is K through 12 or K through 5. But this legislation is broader and bolder and more exciting in my view, where it often starts in the pre-K years and goes all the way to high school. We must not forget our middle and upper middle school children. They deserve the very, very best. And so if I had my druthers, what I'd love to see is a system where the children are receiving consistent, coherent instruction, that different states realize what is working and what is not, and they feel free to adjust what they're doing. I want to see and recognize the importance of community and our wonderful librarians in the world who have such a wonderful contribution to children's understanding of joy and motivation in reading. Reading is not just a skill. It's something that we begin to do and do throughout our lifetime. And then I think finally, what is so essential is that reading has a purpose. You don't just read to read. And so what we need to recognize from the very beginning is the importance of learning about content or knowledge enriching experiences that really help children become smarter and brighter and more excited about learning.
I love that. I was just having a conversation with my 15-year-old about the joy and the essentialness to her well-being that reading and literacy brings to her life. So thank you for your inspiring, thoughtful, and words of challenge to this group gathered today. Greatly appreciate. I'd love now to bring our other panelists forward to join Susan if possible. And while they're coming on, I might just remind everyone to use the Q&A to raise any questions you might have as we move into question and answer a little bit later in the conversation. So are my panelists up? There we go. Okay, so if I could, would all of the panelists though that I've gathered, would you just do a quick reintroduction of yourselves so that the group can see who you are and put a face with the name as you're coming on screen. So Mary Catherine, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Ricker, and I am a board certified teacher currently serving as executive director of the Albert Shanker Institute. It's great to be here.
And Esther, how about you next?
Hi, my name is Esther Quintero, and I am a senior fellow at the Albert Shanker Institute. Very happy to join the conversation.
Okay, great. And Kayla.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Rice, and I am a research consultant at the Albert Shanker Institute.
Okay, so we're going to do a little bit deeper dive even to start to discuss this incredible work and study that's been happening and the all-encompassing work of the Albert Shanker Institute. So Mary Catherine, could I start with you, please, and just ask you to give a brief introduction to the study that you've been working on with the Institute.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about previewing this study, and we're really excited to share it. And actually to sort of get into what we decided to do, we actually have to back up to some of the first conversations we had. I was a new executive director to the Albert Shanker Institute, coming from my work as Commissioner of Education. And I knew students would need a long-term support from their pandemic experiences. I had been researching, reading. I had also been looking at the trends and the very robust public discussion. And I was really welcomed by very receptive colleagues at the Shanker Institute and into a think tank that has a very long history of being committed to the science of reading. And they have a series they developed called Let's Talk, one about oral language development, one about early literacy development, investment in research and dissemination on literacy ladders. And the Let's Talk work really stimulated public discussion about these issues. And in talking to Esther and Kayla, who you're going to hear from, and Susan as a board member who you heard from, and our colleague Bernie Bond, we realized that we needed to very robustly renew our commitment to students, to families, to educators, schools, and allies in strengthening reading discussion. And we knew we had an ability to convene. In fact, one of the core commitments of the Albert Shanker Institute is to celebrate the power of ideas by expanding access to information, encouraging free and rigorous debate, and finding ways for intellectuals to test their ideas with practical action. And we knew that when it came to reading, That's exactly what our students deserved. And so in talking with each other, in looking at the core work we had started, in looking at the expertise Susan brought on board, the deep expertise Esther has from her longstanding work and research in conditions for teaching, the expertise Kayla was bringing on board as both a researcher and a classroom teacher with long-term experience in English language arts, we realized we needed to commit to look beyond early reading instruction. And you just heard Susan mention that that yes, it is very important for reading instruction to focus on our youngest readers, yet if we only focus on our youngest readers, we are leaving out our middle school students, our high school students, even our adults who still deserve the best teaching and the best thinking on how to master their reading skills. And we recognized we also needed to bring a systemic or organizational approach to this implementation that was happening, that we were reading about, that we were hearing about, and that we knew from the research needed to happen. So often in education, which is a very complex system, very simplified solutions are offered. And when a simplified solution gets injected into a complex system, a lot can go wrong, even with the best of intentions. Something can get watered down, something can get sort of misdirected. A lot of those things can happen. And we knew we needed to really commit to that organizational approach. What were the comprehensive efforts we wanted to see were happening? What were some of the holes? What areas were being missed, so that these best efforts this time actually really move the needle? They really make a difference. And that commitment, whether it's happening state by state, even district by district, was in a comprehensive enough fashion that it was really going to make a difference for our students. And we wanted to make sure we brought fresh perspectives, especially the established or emerging science that is culturally specific, focuses on multicultural and multilingual assets that students and families bring to literacy learning, and voices in the research and practitioner community that deserve to be amplified. So those commitments that we then made really then took us to this place where we realized that a lot of states were doing a lot of work, and we wanted to see in the aggregate what that meant for students and their families in the field. And that brought us to this assignment where we took a 4-year period, looked at every bill introduced in every state house in the country, and we determined that we were going to look for multiple points of addressing what it was really going to take to teach students to read and follow the evidence. And that led to this magnificent research assignment that we are on the verge of releasing, that I've been supporting with these research partners.
Yes, and we're very excited when that release will take place. And I know it's emerging and it will be soon. So thank you for teeing it up today so that we're all ready and waiting and looking to dive in to your tremendous work. So thank you, Mary Catherine. So Esther, as I mentioned, I quoted your piece a little bit earlier, and I know Hattie is going to share it in the chat now, but demystifying the science of reading. There's been a lot of debate, discussion around this term. Could you share a bit on how we should best understand the science of reading? Can you dive into that topic a little bit for us?
Sure. And thank you for your kind words on the post. And a lot of people have written about this. Not the only one. In fact, part of me was like, do we really need another post saying that the science of reading is not phonics? And I thought we did, because in our conversations with colleagues, with friends, as we've been socializing our report, and we keep finding misconceptions, and they keep getting bigger, like people sort of mixing up this science of reading phrase with specific programs, sometimes as specific phonics programs, not just phonics as an area, but actually a phonics method. So I thought, okay, so maybe we need to keep saying this, and we need to say it simply, and we need to say it, many of us need to say it, because each of us sort of trusts a certain voice. And unfortunately, some of these debates become political. So it seemed like the more we say, the more diverse places we come from, maybe the more it will register. And then the idea, I wanted to sort of keep it very simple, in the sense of appealing to people's sort of gut feelings about what that sentence might mean. Like when you hear the science of something, I don't know, it probably evokes a body of knowledge, for many of us, like it's not something very, very narrow. Like if I say the science of human behavior, nobody's going to think about, oh, is this memory or something really specific? So it was kind of appealing to, like, what's your basic intuition about what this is, and trust that intuition. Yeah, it is a big field. It is a big sort of body of research. And I wanted to use throughout the post other sentences, because to avoid what is becoming a label. So reading science, evidence-based reading, science of reading, all of those, I think, get at the same idea, which is we need to base policy decision and practice decisions on the best research that we have about reading and about how children learn to read. So that was kind of what motivated it. And I can kind of share a couple more ideas in the post that I wanted to really say. It felt like I was venting. One is this idea that the science of reading, I think, exists in the broader, it's not in a vacuum, it exists in the broader education research, and there are many other sciences that are overlapping with that science of reading. And it came up in conversation, Mary Catherine alluded to organizational dimension. So organizational science, Susan talked about implementation science, improvement science. All those pieces are also science, and they intersect with the science of reading. And we need to understand how they help and how they intersect. So it's kind of, that was another point I wanted to make. I think the third big point I wanted to make is it's particularly problematic to us at the Shanker Institute with when some of this work is portrayed as anti-teacher, as too prescriptive. I think, again, implementation, it much of it depends on how things are done on the ground. So when educators have problems, we must investigate where they come from and, try to address them. But the science of reading in and of itself is not obviously anti-teacher. It's about teachers gaining more knowledge and more expertise in a domain. So in a way, it is empowering. It should be empowering. If it's not empowering, we're doing something wrong, and we need to revise how we're rolling things out on the ground. But the actual science of reading, this idea that it is anti-teacher is just not justified. And I wanted to say it that, it's not like that. So those are some thoughts that I had with the post, with what I wrote.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It was very thought-provoking for sure. So appreciated having some more commentary on that. I know, Esther, in a second, you're going to talk about the methodology that you as a research team employed, but maybe if I could go to whether it's Kayla, Mary Catherine, or Susan, can you back up just a few steps and talk, Mary Catherine, you kind of started to talk about this a little bit, but just your primary motivations, like what, it's like, oh, there's something here, we need to step forward as an institute. And if we don't, I've often heard the phrase, the cost of doing nothing. So what were those motivations for any three of you who want to jump in that said, this is time and we must do this?
I can jump in because I think a lot of it was just a classic, the classic beginning of a piece of research where, you start with a hypothesis. In this case, we probably started with a half a dozen. And part of it was just checking some of the assumptions that were starting to get made in popular discussion, whether it was on a social media platform, whether it was on someone's blog, or whether it was in a news article, these assumptions that there was a singular focus, perhaps just on phonics, and a wondering if that was really true. And then, other articles popping up saying that, gosh, it seems like, this state is really moving forward. What's happening in other states? And that question just sort of remaining unanswered. And, we found ourselves gathering these sort of questions, these hypotheses, and realizing that the answer was going to be in going through, and we had to kind of create some parameters. We weren't going to look through the last 50 years or the last 25 years. So we took this 4-year period, and we were fairly purposeful with starting in 2019 and going through 2022, because we wanted to see, as we saw some really captivating news stories, whether it was Emily Hanford's work, some podcasting that really started to get reading discussions in sort of popular groups, right? It wasn't just among early learning teachers anymore. It wasn't just among researchers. We were starting to see more and more people talk about it. So we felt like that seemed like a good place to start, to see what would, to sort of capture maybe what was happening sort of just as some of those stories were breaking through popular consciousness, and what was happening maybe just before, all the way into, that period also covers a lot of work state legislators were doing at the beginning of the pandemic and into the pandemic, as some of the reading support conversations, or just general student support conversations started to mature. And so that was the rationale for really going to see what state legislators were doing. Now, I will say one of the things very quickly, as a former state education official, I recognized early on, I said this to Esther and Kayla and Susan frequently, and that was that we knew legislation was not the only way to improve reading instruction. So what we decided to say at the very beginning is, if a whole legislature decided to act and a governor decided to sign something, that meant that the state was sort of sending a message that this was very important to them. And so we didn't want to say this is the only way to improve or strengthen reading instruction in your district, in your state, in your classroom. We recognize, though, that this is a very comprehensive way to address it.
Yeah. Susan, I think you had something to add, maybe?
Yeah, I'd like to add just a comment from my perspective, and I'll tell you why I thought this was so important. And that is, I wanted to galvanize my particular community, which is reading researchers and reading colleagues in the field, to recognize that this is our opportunity. This is an opportunity to really change reading instruction so that all children can achieve reading. It doesn't need to be what we see in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, with so many of our children not succeeding. So I know the science can help, and that's really what brought me to the table in particular. I think that if we all, as a community, work together, we can really make a difference for all of our children. Literacy is essential in this country. And so we can't leave anybody behind. And that was the reason I signed on.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So Esther, could we pivot back to you to talk about, while the report hasn't been released yet, can you give us a preview of the methodology that your research team employed? So if we could pull up that screen, that would be great.
And actually, this is connected to the former question about the goals of the work and what got us into it. There have been some analysis of legislation, but they, some of them, and especially the ones that, in some of them in journalism, they don't feel like, we wanted to do something more systematic. We wanted to really do something very objective, as unbiased as possible. And that is sort of one of the motivations that I think drove the team. At least it drove me, whenever I hear, this state is doing this thing. And I always, my mind, I'm more of a quantitative background, goes to, okay, but this is one state. What about the others? And, how do we know that state is really standing out? And I think with the work that we did, we can make those claims. We can spotlight those states, because we've really actually read those bills, classified those bills. And so it feels really good, from that perspective. So, but I'll share, I feel like we have already shared a little bit about the parameters of the study, but if you want to go to the next slide, this is actually a map showing just the number of bills that have been enacted. They should add to 123. And as you see, we have states like Virginia that passed, 17 bills in 4 years, other states with a lot of activity are Utah and Louisiana. So, but you can see, the sort of the degree of interest in this topic, and it hasn't slowed down. One of the things we're going to do as the Institute is we're committing to continuing to analyze this legislation and tracking this legislation. And Kayla can share more later, but I believe it's over 60 new bills that have been passed since January 23. So, and our first sort of analysis is going to go between 2019 and 2022, but so the level of activity hasn't slowed down. If you can go to the next slide. So we have 223 bills in 46 states. And as I share, 4 years, we focus on those 4 years. We looked at about 40, we call them variables, we call them, topics, but basically they're like domains of interest. And I think we were very good and very systematic about how we identified these areas. And many of those areas come from analyzing the research literature on the specific sort of topic. For example, and Susan was talking about this earlier, like reading, what are the skills involved in reading? And we not only went with the National Reading Panel, 5 pillars, but we also looked at the research on oral language and writing and content knowledge, background knowledge. So we coded for all those things. This is just one example of how we use the literature to sort of determine what we were looking for in the legislation. We read each of those 223 bills, although I have to say Kayla probably read them most, so she can certainly share a lot of details. And we coded those bills. Basically, we used 3 types of codes, which is also another kind of novel aspect of our research. There are other organizations that have coded things like as present or absent, but we went a step further and realized that some of the bills are really just mentioning something in passing, like we will do tutoring, and other bills are really much more detailed, you know, and so we wanted to differentiate those two types of laws. And we coded 0, the concept is not present. For example, professional development is not mentioned. 1 is just mentioned, and 2, it's described in detail. And we did this, we were a team of 4 people coding these bills, and we achieved a pretty good iterator reliability. We kept checking and making sure that we were all seeing the same thing. So we feel good about that process as well. And by the way, when the study is released, we're also making available the data. So, you know, people can use it and expand on it, and do their own analysis. So that's one of the things we want to do. If you want to go to is there a next slide? Yeah, so this is a little bit sort of an outline of the different codes that I was talking about, those 40 variables. So I talked about reading and how we've conceptualized reading broadly, and not just those 5 pillars of the National Reading Panel report. We're really interested in this idea of teacher supports. And, you know, some scholars have talked about this as the infrastructure for reading improvement. You know, the idea that there needs to be not only professional development, but curriculum and leadership, and all those pieces need to kind of work together to sustain and to enable teachers to sort of enact that new knowledge from professional development. So we looked at the bills and whether or not they talk about curriculum, PD, leadership, and teacher preparation. And then, as you can see, there are other important pieces like student supports and assessment. And for us, really the reading, what we're calling the reading ecosystem, what Susan was talking about with community and family being really central. We wanted to kind of go beyond parent notification, which is something that has been, you know, it's present in most of the legislation, but we wanted to really see which states are shining in the sense of wanting to work with families around children's literacy. And we coded for those things. And in addition, you know, things like are the material, you know, are states, you know, calling for the use of culturally relevant materials and things like that. We, of course, coded for students with dyslexia, students for whom English was not first English language learners, and so on. So this is kind of like a view of those variables that we analyze in the bills.
This is great. It's very helpful to be able to see, you know, examples of what was all looked at building into this comprehensive research. So thank you, Esther, for reviewing that. So I'm wondering if I could have the whole panel just maybe get a sneak preview, if you will. Esther used the word spotlights. Exemplars of the literacy legislation that you saw in this review. Can you maybe each give an example of something that you would, you know, take out your highlight marker to for this community to think about and be challenged by or inspired by? So I don't know, Kayla, maybe you could start and kick us off, and we'll just do a little circle and see what everyone has to throw out there.
Great. I have read over 300 bills at this point. So there are 2 that really stand out to me. One would be Texas with professional development for 2 reasons. One, Texas expands professional development beyond 3rd grade. It does K through 12 professional development. And as a secondary English teacher, that was really important to me. And it also provides professional development for all content teachers, not just the English teacher, which is something else that was important to me. Another state is California, and California is doing a lot to support English learners. They have family programs, they have culturally relevant materials, and they have a variety of interventions. So that's another state that's doing really good work.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Suzanne, Mary Catherine, Esther, you have one you want to toss out, one or two?
I don't want to toss out a particular state or whatever. I think that's very useful, but I do want to say that there is a, it's both exciting, but it's also challenging. And that is, in the legislation, we've seen that teachers are the primary source of many of these bills. In other words, they're at the centerpiece of this reading legislation. And what we're seeing is that there's a focus on teacher preparation, there's a focus on professional development, and there's a focus on coaching. And one of the things that we don't see as much is that infrastructure that teachers will need in order to be successful. And we caution states to consider that, because they will need the leadership, they will need the family support, they will need the community support to make this really, really work. The other thing that I would just like to highlight is they'll need a lifespan approach. Pre-K, I'm a pre-K, Kayla, you know that, pre-K through grade 12. We can't stop at grade 5. We can't stop at grade 7. We really need to see this as a lifespan approach so that all of our students are really successful. We also know, and the other thing that's exciting about the legislation that I just want to highlight is, in the past, we focused on Title I schools. We focused on a specific population or schools that were having difficulty. Now we're talking about all schools, or mostly all schools. We're including charter schools in that. We're including schools that have been very successful. We're saying, let's get on the same page. Let's talk a consistent and a coherent message. And I think that's really, really important. And Esther, I bet you have something else that we're missing.
I'll go with a couple of examples, but first I'd like to say that we found areas of growth for sure, and the report keeps a very positive tone, but for sure there are areas that we present as opportunities for improvement. But it is also true that about a dozen states have pretty comprehensive legislation, and of course this is just the beginning. It needs to be rolled out, it needs to be implemented. The devil is in the details, but I think we have been, sort of surprised in a very good way about some of this work. And so it's not just the exemplar states that are going to be highlighted in the report, but in addition to those these are highlighted for like an area like PD or student supports. There are other states that we highlight for being very comprehensive, for trying to be very comprehensive. So, but having said that, the state that I was going to mention is Utah. The way that Utah legislation talks about capacity building, I think, makes it a very interesting case to study. The role of leadership is to build capacity in their schools. Mm-hmm. And we don't often see that type of language that is needed. And that goes back to the idea of, kind of developing and maintaining that infrastructure. So I think Utah is definitely deserves to be highlighted. Michigan is a state that, you saw in the slide that I shared before about these different types of student supports that we looked at. There are very few states that provide a comprehensive set of supports. However, Michigan is one of those states that does. They basically talk about after school and summer school and tutoring and reading plans, and the legislation does so in great detail. So I think that's another good example in terms of like supports for students.
Great, thank you. Mary Catherine, do you want to toss out a spotlight or two?
Yeah, I am excited to, and I'm going to toss this out by saying that it is a growth area. But we're seeing some promising results. If we go back to the beginning of the webinar, and Susan mentioned something upon reflection of all of the work she did, that one of the things she's encouraged by what she's seen is more intention about family and community engagement. And we are seeing some promising ideas out there. And one of the things that has always been a core value of mine from my time as a classroom teacher and in my other roles has been meaningful family engagement, moving beyond and maybe even moving away from those cattle call conferences and letters sent home just to check a box, and really meaningfully engaging families where they are, and not always asking families to be at the school or do what the school wants them to do, but finding families where they are, and meaningful community engagement. And so a couple examples, Colorado actually has an example of some meaningful community engagement where they were very intentional about a role for their public libraries. And I think I saw in the chat someplace again about this idea of, teachers should not be the only ones to be accountable for student learning. Teachers are very responsible for student learning, absolutely. And if we overlook this whole ecosystem of support that can help students with reading, then we're overlooking some incredibly rich resources for our students, whether they be our public library. I actually see an old friend who I just admire so much in the Q&A, Giovanni Ford, who runs just an incredible program in Minnesota. I got the chance to visit as commissioner. When we overlook those community-based partners, people who care just as desperately about student reading, children reading, middle school students reading, adults reading, new language learners reading as classroom practitioners, we're boxing with both arms behind our back, or whatever the phrase is. So the Colorado example is a good one. Alaska also has a great example of family, parent involvement, again, meaningful parent involvement, not just, a letter that needs to go home, letting them know what their student scored on a test, but something meaningful. And so I'm encouraged by those, and I'm excited to see more.
It seems to me through the comments so far that opportunity resides in that key word of "and," right? It isn't the singular, it is the opportunity in "and." So I appreciate those reflections. So Kayla, if I could bounce to you, you also wrote a very interesting blog post really related to teachers and what they have to say about current literacy paradigms and just what they think is missing from the conversation comprehensively. So what surprised you? What did you take away? And reflect a little bit on the blog post that you wrote.
Yeah, of course. When we started this project, Esther actually came to me and she's like, let's see what teachers are saying about literacy instruction. So I did some research and I found 2 surveys from Ed.D and the International Literacy Association. And it was for elementary teachers, but I was surprised by some of the results and what teachers felt like they needed support in. One of the big things was they said they needed more support implementing the 5 pillars. They said that they felt that pre-service programs just didn't prepare them as much as they thought they should. And also that these pre-service programs varied so much from state to state, even institution to institution. Teachers said that they learned most of their knowledge from professional development, but they wanted professional development to look different. They wanted it to be ongoing, collaborative, relevant, interactive, flexible. Mary Catherine always says that teachers don't want PD at them. They want to do PD with this presenter. And that was noted in these results. They said they wanted more support from school leaders, so instructional coaches and principals, and they wanted new ways to engage parents. They thought they weren't doing a good job of that, and they wanted new ways to do that. So after looking at these results, when we were coming up with our variables, we definitely took into account that we wanted to use some of these things when we were looking at the policies.
That's great. I just want to briefly remind those joining us that please use the Q&A to pose any questions you would like addressed as we approach the end of the webinar here today. So just a little reminder to our all of you joining us. I'd like to now go, there's always a lot of conversation about how much does state legislation really matter? How much does that really elevate the conversation, bring support to the classroom? So again, I'm going to open this up to everyone, but maybe Mary Catherine, if you could lead us off on what is the value of state legislation and speak to the necessity that it holds or doesn't hold. I won't lead with the question for really effective change. So if you could kind of start us off on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked. And like I mentioned earlier, and I will be clear about this as we talk about this report, as important as I believe this report is, and in the ways I can see it impacting all of us who care deeply about strengthening reading instruction. I know that legislation is not the only way to do that. No one needs to wait for a state legislative body to act and a governor to sign a bill to improve reading instruction. There are great resources out there. A district superintendent, a charter school director can gather the experts in their, district or in their charter school. They can gather the experts in their community, and they can co-create evidence-based reading instruction practices in their district or their charter school, for example. That being said, I do appreciate your question, because I think it's important for us to, and we did this a lot. You probably heard from Susan and Esther and Kayla, from all of us, asking why would a legislature decide to act? Legislators and governors, state education officials, historically care deeply or respect greatly local control. And so when it is not lost on me as an education leader to see the sheer number of legislators who have acted on reading in these past few years, and governors who have then signed bills to say, we should sit up and say, what do we think about that? Like sort of the typical, the typical teacher question of students, right? What do you notice? What do you wonder? And I notice that legislators have decided that this is an issue important enough to them that they wanted statewide action. And this also generally means everybody's in, nobody's out, right? When a district administrator acts on something, it can be great for that district. When legislators are being thoughtful about statewide supports for reading instruction, they're saying this is, they have a lot to act on, right, in any legislative session. And so if they have decided to act on this, they are saying this rises to the top. This is critically important to them. And I actually take that as a message to students and their families and educators and the whole community, that that is a message of caring so much that we are going to do something about it to support you. Now, I will say there are legislative bodies that have done a lot of work. There are some who have taken first steps. There are some who have taken a couple first steps, and we are encouraging them to keep going. Again, the complexity of supporting, education, teaching and learning, that whole system is going to take a lot of effort. And there isn't just one bill that is going to magically support all of teaching and learning. And so I think we take this as an example that legislatures have found this to be of statewide importance. And that is why they are perhaps working alongside their historic respect for local control.
That's great. I would just also jump in, moderator commentary, so take it or leave it, but I recently was the CEO of a private foundation. So I just want to put out to those on the call, whether you're in the field or you're a partner in the field, or perhaps a funder interested in elevating this conversation, even though this conversation has the word legislation in it, don't take that as your pass to not be involved, especially private foundations. This is the critical place. And for those on the calls, invite your funding community into this conversation, because the role of funders can be, just as Mary Catherine stated at the beginning of the Craig Foundation or Institute, bringing people together to have informed conversation, knowledge building, capacity building. Again, that and of the conversation is for our whole community an essential role that we play together. So that's a side commentary from your moderator. So I will stop talking and move it back if Susan, Kayla, or Esther have anything that you want to add of the value of state legislation, if you'd like to join in on what Mary Catherine offered. Okay, well, see, we're just going to click at the right amount of time here. So Mary Catherine, I'm going to kind of do a final wrap question with you, and that the study is set to be released yet this summer. What would you say might represent your team's hopes for how it can be useful going into the fall semester and beyond?
Yes, I'm very excited about this. I know that I love research, and I love figuring out how research jumps off a page and improves people's lives. And so we really, from the entire time, as you know, you heard how Esther and Kayla and Susan and others were eyeball deep in this legislation. We kept talking about, so what are we going to do with this? What does it mean? And this is what we were getting at, Suzanne. What we'd like to see is, we really had an intention that as a lot of the most negative aspects of the reading conversation focused on who do we blame and how much blame do they get and who gets more blame and other blame. We actually wanted, I'm going to borrow a phrase Esther used early in our shaping of this, we really wanted a learning agenda. And this is where states could see where they were, and you could see where your state was, and we could create a roadmap for where to go next. That if you're, rather than, we will not be ranking states. We are not going to be giving people, stars, nobody gets a number or a letter grade. We're not doing any of that. We're essentially saying, here's the evidence. Here's where your state is implementing the evidence. We'll be really clear with what I said earlier. This doesn't mean there's nothing happening in your state. It could be happening because of an executive order. There could be things happening because of superintendent decided to do something, because your charter school director decided to do something. This is an opportunity for you to use our research to ask questions. For example, here's this great bill in Colorado around community engagement. Are we in our school doing anything around community engagement? Or do we have any partners working with us? Does our state have partners? This should serve as an invitation so that an advocate can take this research and ask, where are we with this? Could we do this next? I'm really interested in what this state did with professional development. How do we implement something like that there? And so we want this this research to, again, sort of come off the page and come into conversations and come into advocacy so that we can all keep growing and keep implementing what it is we know our students deserve and those teaching and learning conditions need. And, to an earlier point, there is not going to be just one solution. But if you find, you take out this report and you find your state has implemented one thing so far, you've implemented one thing so far. Let's show you the next two things you can implement, right? Let's show you the next two areas you can grow to support that teaching and learning environment that really needs that comprehensive support. So we are most excited about seeing this research get into the hands of advocates to keep growing the progress that we've seen made across the country in these last few years.
And could I add, Suzanne, we want one more constituency that I'd like to add, and that is when I worked with Al Shanker, I was very interested in the reading professional and the reading researcher, and I said it's time for us to act collaboratively. That there cannot be another reading war. Reading war was very harmful to our students, and it really put us back prior to the science of reading. So I think what is really critical is this is sort of our time that get us together with reading professionals, with people in higher ed institutions, coming together, recognizing that so many of our children are not thriving and that literacy is absolutely essential to their well-being. And so if we act coherently and collaboratively, I think we can really, really make a difference. And so I look forward next year or the year after going on the campaign for grade level reading and saying, there, we've done it. We've gotten there. All of our children are reading successfully at the end of grade 3, and we know that they will be successful in life.
That's perfect. Well, we'll move into question and answer now, but I just wanted to say a deep thank you to all of you for joining this conversation today. This conversation and the report that will be coming out clearly is a research knowledge-based invitation to come together collaboratively for the well-being of our kids and our communities. So thank you for extending that invitation in this way. So there's a poll that's coming up. I would encourage you all to please take that poll and give your feedback to the campaign. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Hattie, who's been busy capturing questions, and I'm gonna hand it off to her to facilitate a little question and answer final 10 minutes of this webinar. Hattie.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers. My excitement continues to grow about this study. So I'll start out with a question about framing high quality public education. How do we frame it as a public good that benefits all and not something that only matters to parents? Any of you are welcome to jump in as you have done the research on these bills. Maybe you can draw on some of the experience there, or just your experience in this field in general.
I think I'll jump in first. Especially what you said at the beginning of the framing of high quality public education. And it is one of the problems you have when you're actually trying to support something that is really good and rich and robust and complex, as we've been saying during this webinar, when you're up against someone who perhaps is just using a soundbite. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we actually do have research about how students learn and on our side. So starting with, we meet the natural curiosity of our students is one example that we can use to talk about the really rich, inclusive work our public schools do. Our students bring a natural curiosity to school. And Susan talked about knowledge-rich curriculum. Our students actually crave meaning in that interconnectedness. Our brains seek meaning, quite frankly. And when we send it back, when we send conversations about the really high quality work our public schools are doing, we actually have evidence on our side. And so going back to what that evidence is and being confident in that evidence is one way of several, I'm sure my fellow panelists will share, of making sure that people understand that public schools are here for good.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit more concrete, about asking if you all have cataloged the text of these bills in any way. The question asker said this would be a really useful way to replicate thoughtful legislative efforts in other states without ranking, like you said.
We have, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we have a data set, a spreadsheet with these codes, So the spreadsheet is at the bill level. So for every bill, we have documented whether or not these variables appear or not, and to what extent, how many times in some cases. So it's all going to be available for folks to download to that. And the idea is for others to do their own analysis and draw their conclusions.
We also have a Tableau website coming where users can go in, click on their state, see the bills passed from 2019 to 2022, and click on the bill title and go directly to a PDF version. So lots of ways to view the information from the bills.
Excellent. And I know the burning question is, how do people get notified of when this study is going to be released? What's the best way for people to find this once it's out?
I'll start. You can absolutely follow the Albert Shanker Institute and on our social channels on Twitter and on Facebook. Go to our website, shankerinstitute.org. I also know, thanks to our, we will send out an email the day of our release. And I also know, thanks to our partnership here with Campaign for Grade Level Reading, that we will make sure the campaign has a link and that it can be sent out via the campaign as well. So we are going to have multiple ways of getting it out there. Those are just a handful. And we look forward to everyone getting their hands on it.
Excellent. Another question we have is about some of what you saw in the research. Have you seen any sort of weaponizing or politicalizing within state policy around reading instruction that gives you pause or a reason for caution?
I've been meaning to find space to share this. One concern is, and we saw this a little bit in the bills that we looked at, but it seems like a growing trend in the newer bills that are being introduced and passed. And it's this idea of banning certain practices and banning certain materials. And I don't think that, going back to that collaborative tone that we want to strike and this working together. I don't think that sort of practice strikes that tone, and that is unrelated to the merits of the idea of the material, you know, if it's evidence-based or not, but it's just the banning of it. And, you know, this of course gets also, it's in the mix with other, you know, book banning. I just don't think educators are going to be receiving those messages very positively. So that's an area of concern that we're seeing on the ground and in the newer legislation.
Go ahead.
Like
go ahead,
add,
Susan.
Another caution, and that is much of the legislation focuses on the 5 pillars. And I began today to talk about lessons learned from reading first. And if we take those pillars and say, okay, now it's time for phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, almost as if it's a recipe for a cake, we will fail. It is, first thing, the National Reading Panel report was written in 2000. It's now 2023, so it's old. We know a whole lot more. We know about the importance of oral language, the importance of writing. We know the importance of content knowledge. So I think that one of the things that we have to be very careful of is compartmentalizing reading and not seeing it as a comprehensive kind of process. Where the other thing we have to be careful of, excuse me, is some people are talking about these laws as if they're phonics based. Phonics is one skill, but there are a whole lot of other skills that children really need to know in order to be successful.
Thanks. One of the things that I've been finding so compelling about the work that you're all doing is this drive for positive messaging and not ranking states, not saying if you're not doing this, then you're not doing it well enough, but rather what is out there, what's going on, and what are areas for forward movement. And we had a question on what can be done to sort of counter the negative messaging that is out there. You mentioned, you know, the teacher bashing, these sort of blanket bans on particular approaches. So how can we, either through the specific work that you've been doing or more broadly, how can we combat that?
I'll jump in because this is definitely something I experienced as a classroom teacher before I actually left my classroom for teacher leadership positions. And I think when you treat teachers as a group that's sort of out there, as opposed to bringing them into the conversation, that it makes teacher bashing easier when you're sort of teaching teachers as a group that you're not engaging with. And I would say that for all of us. There are some cases where I would probably tell anyone listening today that you have no obligation to engage in a conversation with someone who is demeaning you or something that is dangerous or really damaging to who you are as a person. And aside from that, where we can engage with each other, we will be slow to blame each other. And so engaging teachers and then engaging family members, engaging community, bringing people to a table to co-create solutions, even bringing people to a table to hear the rationale for your decisions is a step in the direction that says we are all equally important to the education of our students. And then where it's developmentally appropriate, and in developmentally appropriate ways, bringing students themselves to those tables, again, we are slow to blame when we are sitting across from each other, and committing to each other that we're going to find solutions that are in the best interest of our students.
I'll just say that we have tried very hard in the report to use a certain language that is engaging rather than, we know, I think those of us that have been in the space and know what can be a trigger and why. And we've tried very hard to stay away from those and focus on the issues and focus on the describing what we found and trying to keep it really kind of level-headed. And we're hoping that serves two purposes. First, it informs and it's objective and it's, factual. And second, we're hoping that, the various sides out there can learn and draw from it because they don't feel like personally attacked, because it's getting really very nasty. And so we've tried very hard to not contribute to that vitriol out there.
I think that really comes across. Before I get into these last two questions from our audience, I just wanted to remind everybody who's still on to fill out the poll if you haven't. We really do use this. We review this every week to continue to improve our weekly webinar series, so it's really helpful for us. One of the questions that we got had to do with promoting bilingual education or multilingual education. So as you were coding and conducting your research, were you including legislation around this?
We were coding for this during our research. We coded for bilingual and multilingual learners. Not to give away anything too juicy, but a lot of the language around this topic was related to seals of biliteracy. So that's kind of where we're going with that.
Great.
And it was one of the initial commitments we made to our, like in the Shanker Institute's recommitment to reading instruction. We really wanted, again, to commit to those, to bringing established or emerging science that was culturally specific and focused on multicultural and multilingual assets that students and families bring to literacy learning. And this research will be part of that, but this is by no means the last thing we will do. We are going to continue to look at that as a unique opportunity. And I'll just share from a personal perspective, when the pandemic first hit and we were having conversations about students going to school physically or remote instruction, one of the things I said to anyone who would listen, including teachers I would gather in Zoom, webinars like this, I would say, design instruction for your students who are most vulnerable first, right? Your students who are going to have perhaps the greatest barriers to remote instruction, your students experiencing housing instability or homelessness, your students with special needs, your students who are learning English as a new language, your students who may be navigating other things. And I would list those considerations, design it for them first, and you will design a system that works for all students. When you design a generic system and tack on accommodations afterwards, students feel that. They know they were a second thought. And so we are really excited about digging into whether it is state legislation, whether it is research, other things that are showing where practices are working that center the specific needs of students, as opposed to sort of tack something on as an afterthought.
Wonderful. Thank you. For our final question, I want to start with Kayla, if that's all right. You in your blog post that we mentioned earlier, you talk about what teachers are saying about what they need, and you talked about not only teacher, professional development, but what kind of professional development. So the last question that we have is, how do we approach pedagogy in an effective and systematic way? How can we better teach teachers to be teachers? If we were doing a better job with this, would it be easier to or better to trust teacher autonomy? So what are your thoughts on that? And then if anybody else would like to chime in, that's great.
I do think a lot of this goes back to PD. I think as I was a teacher, and I know it is not best practice to have students sit there for 8 hours while you lecture to them. And that is how a lot of PD sessions still are. I did a lot of PD in my decade of teaching, and that's exactly what was happening. And so you're just not absorbing the information that you need to, and you're not engaged because you just feel like someone's talking to you. So I think we definitely need to transform how we're doing teacher PD. And for the autonomy piece, Susan always talks about this idea of flexibility. So I'm actually going to call on Susan to elaborate on that.
Well, I would say that we need to treat our teachers as if they are smart, caring individuals who know a lot, because guess what? They do. And they know their children well. So one of the things that we must acknowledge is that science is not settled. Science occurs in the context of that classroom where that teacher notes what that child is doing and what needs to happen in order to make a difference. And so I want to echo some of the work that Mary Catherine has described and said that we need to have we need to understand that our teachers are the centerpiece of all this legislation, in my view, and treat them as professionals because that's what they are. And what they will do, and what we have to acknowledge is we can't just say that science is the National Reading Panel Report and these 5 pillar skills. We need to rely on our teachers to work with children to ensure that they're really successful, and only they can really do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. This has been such an interesting conversation, and I cannot wait for the study to be released. I will be anxiously awaiting the email in my inbox that it's out. As a reminder, we've got our GLR week next week. We've got a number of sessions, any of which will be interesting to many of our audience members. So you're able to register for that. We'd love to see you there. Thank you to Suzanne for moderating this conversation. We appreciate you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.